there's a parenting philosophy out there that I've encountered fairly recently, which is that this is a tough world to live in. And so we need to actually toughen our kids up. We need to let them be exposed to everything that's out there because this is what they're going to need to contend with as adults. And my philosophy is one that I haven't been able to put words to as elegantly as what you just did, but that was so helpful for me to hear about how if we are the gatekeeper for our children and we help them to remain in that sanctuary space, then they're able to form their own discernment.
Even if you think of a pregnant woman, in a way, there the membrane's very physical. It's actually the the womb, and then the little ones out there in the world. And I know quite a few parents who they feel like, okay, now they've entered more of an extended womb space. Like there's a very strong protective sense of let's keep, the shades down, or the stimuli gentle and soft. As a parent, we're literally standing at that interface or at that membrane, which is as the child grows, becomes ever widened and broader. Right at the beginning, it's just the little nest of just mama and dad and maybe siblings and any other close caregivers. And then it's like the kids down the street, and then it might be the school or the village, and it goes all the way until there's a maybe even a global sense. We're tasked with being aware of what comes through that membrane to our child. And of course, we can just not do that part of parenting, and we can just have the windows wide open. But I think many of us who are into conscious parenting feel like it's actually a really essential role, is to be a filter, like a discernment filter, especially in the early years, especially from like birth to 8, when the degree of absorption, almost like open sponge, that a child comes into the world with, is at its height when they're newborn and then slowly comes down. So there's a developmental shift in how much gatekeeping we need to do. The most gatekeeping, in a way, happening in the early years. And then, they start taking on some of their own gatekeeping, right? They have their own choices. And especially, I find, when children have been honored in that way, when they haven't had to well, for one thing, they haven't become traumatized or jolted, or they haven't had to stunt their own sensitivity by putting up false barricades. So if they've been allowed to actually keep growing up with their sensitivity intact, um, and then grow their own discernment capacity and grow their own sturdiness, then, at a quite surprisingly young age, they're incredibly clear about what they're actually up for and what not, and what feels right and what doesn't, and what feels healthy and what doesn't, to the point where they can say, I don't want to read that book anymore. And you can say why, and they'll know exactly why, because it troubles them in this particular way. And the disturbance was more than the enjoyment of the book.
That helps me to understand the power of my intuitive sense to help my children to remain soft and honor their sensitivity and help them to learn who they are within that container of protection before they're desensitized or bombarded by what's in the outside world, really giving them that chance to incarnate, as Rudolf Steiner would talk about.
What you're pointing to is a developmental view, because you have sort of the two extremes. You have the completely sheltered, forever sheltered, where the child is really not prepared to go out in the world and would literally get blown over by a breeze, right? So
Yes.
that's sort of the one extreme. And then you have the other extreme where life's tough, so let's just blow open the doors and let all the winds fly in. Tornadoes and hurricanes, survive or die kind of thing. And I think what we're both sensing is it's not one or the other. It's actually, in a way, it's a both and a third. It's like, ideally, humans could remain in as intact and as whole as possible, and that actually takes some protection, because the world is not becoming more sane. If anything, it's becoming increasingly insane, right? I mean, there's obviously a lot of good and true and beautiful, but there's a lot that feels off kilter, as you're well aware of, with technology now. The walls of our house, like the shelter of our home, has dissolved, right? It's
Hmm.
just have a phone in your hand, and suddenly you have no more walls to your house. It's the world just comes flooding in. Maybe I'll add one more point. From a neurological point of view, the first 3 years, there's so much wiring that's happening and so much deep imprint that's happening, that my view has always been, let's first create as much as possible a sane, a wholesome, um, a safe, joyous, celebratory initial imprint of what life is. Because that's
Yes.
what I think actually life could be and should be. So let's begin with that so that the initial matrix for a child and their reference point from then on after will be connected with something that actually just felt right and beautiful and true and grace filled and kind and joyous. Um,
Yes.
and then to gradually, and this is the gatekeeping, like if you decide what your kid can watch or hear and eat and do, and you stayed as strong in your gatekeeping when they're 3 as when they're 10, you'd end up being more of a police force rather than a parent when they're 10. Like, you would be constraining and limiting and suffocating the child whose natural impulse is to go out and explore and adventure and find out about the world. So there needs to be in my view, in a way, a cocooning, a sanctuary, a sanctifying of those original early years when the imprints are so deep, and then a gradual opening up while giving your child capacities to actually deal with what's coming at them. It's not just an opening up and it's like, well, just deal. It's more like, teach them discernment tools, teach them emotional regulation, teach them how to work with the degree of sensitivity that they carry with them into the world. And so that, in a way, they're equipped. And then it's a gradual opening. And I don't think it's possible to prevent heartbreak. I think we all
Mhm.
experience that as humans. And then obviously when we're parenting, as much as we'd love to spare our kids the heartbreak, it happens. I remember when our daughter was 10, and she really understood that there are animals going extinct. It was polar bears at the time, and she just wept. And I wept with her, because it's like when that kind of sensitivity meets the craziness of the world, well, that's actually a very appropriate response, right?
Mhm.
Weep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And your daughter was 10 at the time. And what we're finding with these really young children, ages 3 to 9, that finding out that the polar bears are going extinct is actually an inappropriate topic for young children because it brings on so much pain inside that they're not ready. They're still needing, as Steiner would say, they need to be shown that the world is safe and the world is beautiful before they're asked to save the polar bears or being told about the devastation that's occurring.
Yes, and I think one of the most sacred forces in a human being is a sense that I can do something, like that I have, in a way, I'm a cause for an effect, like I can make stuff happen, right? In a way, we want to raise empowered adults. And so this is the both and. It's like, if you completely protect, then there's no readiness. Then it's like a bit of it's kind of a collapse when suddenly it all comes rumbling in. But if you let it all rumble in too early, there's not even the time to develop the capacities to feel like you can do anything about anything, right? And so that's a different form of disempowerment.
Yes. Oh, that's such a great point. And I was reflecting on what you were talking about here of the gatekeeping and at what point I started to um, open up a little bit and allow my children to have more direct experience with the world. My children are still quite young, 6 and 9. But when my son was 3 and my daughter was a baby, and we were at home together, I remember there were times where I needed to put my daughter down for a nap and I needed to ensure that my toddler son wouldn't just run off or get into trouble. And at that time, I didn't know about audio stories. So I was actually looking for replays of shows I'd watched in the 80s that were very gentle, innocent children's shows, because that was one of the only things I found would keep him with such rapt attention that he wouldn't stray from what he was doing and I could have 20 minutes to put his sister down. But I remember how vulnerable that time was because up until age 3, I'd been curating everything that he had come into contact with. The food, like you said, the people that came into the environment, his direct environment, and to start introducing other people's ideas was really hard for me. And I wish I would have had a resource like StoryNest at that time. And that's a big part of the motivation that came for my husband and I in creating it, is that we wanted to make sure that there was a space where every single piece of content in this sanctuary has been pre-listened to by conscious parents with that gatekeeping mentality of, these are very sensitive children in general that are coming into the world, if especially if they're allowed to maintain that sensitivity and innocence. And the media that's available to them right now is shocking to their system, and parents are looking for that very gentle way to fulfill that and satiate that hunger that all children have and even adults have for really meaningful stories that help us to learn who we are and what is this world about and what is my role here and how do I interact with others in this earth plane.
I'm so grateful that you are creating this. And it's interesting now to see these kids who, in a way, were sheltered more. And now, and then the gatekeeping sort of gradually opened, and then they took it on themselves because they knew themselves, because they didn't have to basically numb down when it was too much. So they were actually in touch with what they're up for. And to now see them in their early adulthood and how literally how discerning they are, how accurate they are in their perceptions, um, how they have, it's rather than sort of a fence around them or a blocking off, it's more like a sturdiness from the inside out. People would even see how we were with our daughter and they'd be like, you're coddling her too much, you know, she's too attached, she's, you know. But then by the age of 8 she was having conversations with adults as her own self, and then they would comment, it's like, wow, she's really there, she's like. So I think the developmental view is so essential, and that's how it all makes sense what you're doing. And to think of you and your partner doing this job ahead for so many families is like an incredible gift. Like, I'm just thrilled that you're doing this with the
Oh,
kind of sensitivity that you're expressing. I just think it's an amazing offering.
oh, thank you so much, Miriam. Feels like there's just so much going on in the world, and StoryNest, in our view, is a sanctuary for children to be able to come across content that is only beneficial and nourishing for them.